You mentioned you could say that the old covenant administered the grace of the new covenant, yet they differ in substance. How do we determine or define the substance of a covenant? What does that mean?
The benefits that a covenant gives or offers. I mean, the language of substance is what makes a thing a thing, or what it is in itself.
The essence?
And so, yeah, the essence, substance would be slightly just distinguished in terms, but what it is and what it grants. You know what it is based on what it grants. And the old covenant purifies the flesh. It doesn't purify the conscience. So therefore, because it has an inferior promise and an other promise, a different promise from that of the new covenant, it cannot be the same for substance. And the fact that the grace of Christ is presented to the faith of believers secondarily through typology in the old covenant still doesn't make the old covenant the new covenant. It just
Mm.
means that it's a type of the new covenant and that the grace of Christ is made known there. And so in the old covenant, you have those two levels present. They're both there, but our Presbyterian brothers, our Paedo Baptist dear Reformed brethren, are skipping over the first level. They're skipping over the earthly level. They're skipping over the purification of the flesh, the remission of sins through animal blood, the outward ceremonial holiness. They're skipping over the promise of the old covenant. And because they see the grace of Christ there, they're concluding too quickly and flattening
Mhm.
out the discontinuity between the covenants. And one of my criticisms is that this is often done because of a systematic necessity. It's necessary to maintain the system. And older writers acknowledged this. So if you go back to John Ball, if you go back to Anthony Burgess, if you go back to Stephen Marshall, they will say again and again, so long as the grace of Christ is coming through those Old Testament ordinances, it is the same covenant. For them, that's it. Whereas we would say you're skipping over the blessings and benefits of the old covenant, which are distinct but typical of the new covenant blessings. And so we're not denying the grace of the new covenant present in the old, but we are distinguishing the grace of the new covenant from the grace of the old. To have my flesh purified and my sins remitted in the land of Canaan is a grace. It is a benefit and a blessing from God. But the writer to the Hebrews says that's not it. And if you go back to those sacrifices for that remission, then you're saying Jesus hasn't come. You're saying that Jesus was not the Christ. And that's why a return to the old is not just returning to an old form of the same thing. It's returning to something else that was preparatory and provisional and not the reality. The shadow substance language is informative because my shadow is not me, but it tells you about me. With trigonometry, you could determine my height. From my shadow, you could possibly discern my gender. That would be okay. It's okay to do that. You would discern all kinds of things. Okay, this person's about this height. It seems to be a man. You could know certain things about me from my shadow, but you couldn't speak to my shadow. You couldn't talk to my shadow. You couldn't see a face in my shadow. And so the remission of sins, the purification of the flesh from animal blood, it tells you about Christ, but it's not Christ. It portrays Christ, but it's not Christ. And so the old covenant and all of its typology does the same thing. And that's why I'm happy to use the language of administration, but I don't think it's helpful. Or maybe I should say I'm not happy to use it, but I can
Willing.
use it, but I choose not to.
So they to maybe paraphrase or re-summarize a little bit. So they would say that the old covenant was a means or occasion upon which the benefits of Christ were conferred or imparted to Old Testament saints, in the sense that the sacrificial system, as we explained, illustrates Christ, builds upon the promise by the Spirit that's made effectual for their salvation. They would say, therefore, the old covenant promised regeneration, faith, forgiveness in Christ, all of these new covenant blessings. And we would say that's not a valid logical deduction. The one does not
It's a
follow
non
from the other.
sequitur. Yeah, it does not follow.
Yeah.
We're
And so,
affirming the presence of the grace of Christ in under the old covenant, but we are distinguishing the grace of Christ from the grace of animal blood.
yeah, the old covenant was not union with Christ. The new covenant is union with Christ. The Old Testament saints, on occasion of aspects in the old covenant, were united to Christ, made part of the new covenant. That does not mean the old and the new are the same covenant with the same promises. So the author
Correct.
of Hebrews says these promises are different. These promises of the new covenant are better.